Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this Armortek 1/6 scale radio-controlled German King Tiger heavy tank. Since the last video update, more progress has been made to the rear engine deck area, basically finishing it up to a point where it's just about ready to paint. We'll be going over all the additions and modifications that went into this area over here in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info flying right at you. So picking up where we left off in the last video, the grill work here were completely modified and we're ready for the next step. However, because of the shortage of fasteners, I had to postpone the installation. Well, fortunately I have the bolts now so I could get the job done. In order to secure these in place, with the way the kit is designed, you have these 4 holes right here and they get secured via the fasteners to the appropriate locations found on the rear deck of the engine deck, and also a side angle flange system that's built into the hull itself. Well, as I touched upon briefly in the last video, because of the addition of the engine compartment interior and also just with the tight confines found in those locations over there, trying to install these with the kit method is a bit problematic. So I needed to go ahead and come up with a different solution for the securement of the rear engine deck. And basically the idea that I had in mind was the entire engine deck be one piece that then drops directly into place on the rear portion of the hull. The unit's going to be held in place not necessarily with fasteners, but with more or less a mixture of bolts and silicone. The bolts are just going to act more or less as guide pins, making sure everything lines up and stays in its allocated location, but the silicone's really going to be there to keep it in place and prevent it from flopping around. The silicone is also a temporary bond, and this is extremely important specifically for a radio-controlled vehicle because in the engine compartment area on the rear section there is some important mechanical systems like the torsion bars and the idler systems and things like that, and it would be really important to get to those sections in the case of a really bad emergency. Well, obviously, if everything is secured permanently in place, that's not exactly going to be easily done. So if the units are semi-removable, where they're not exactly removable, you know, on the fly, it's not really meant for that, but it's meant that in case there's an emergency, you can go ahead and yank everything out, and you're going to cause minimum damage to any of the components in question. So the way this is going to be done is that these pieces here are going to be secured to the engine deck via the 2 fasteners that we have here. The sections are going to receive absolutely no modifications whatsoever. They're just going to be secured with the kit method. The only difference is that, of course, there are those meshwork covers that I'm going to be circling back to momentarily. But outside of that, these pieces here are going to be pretty much stock. The interesting bit is on this end over here, because on the vehicle, this would secure to the side hull that has that angle strip with the perforations in it. Well, you can't just have the fasteners in place for a couple reasons. First, again, circling back to the grill covers, they are going to add a bit of tension or torsion to this section over here, and they're going to want to pop up, and it's not really going to hold them down very well. The other thing is you need some kind of a alignment system so that the piece can lock into those perforations, albeit without the nut, but it still can slide in nonetheless, and it'll hold it in place until the silicone does its job. And also, even without the silicone, the pegs descending into the perforation plate, since there's so many of them, it's going to act as a way to grasp into those sections and actually holds it in pretty well. But regardless, a nut is going to be needed to secure the fastener in place because, again, you just can't rely on glues alone. It just won't hold. But you can't exactly have a nut on the opposite end because then it's going to make contact with the plate found on the hull. So what is the solution? Well, solution is basically pretty simple. Here you can see the stock piece over here with the stock holes just drilled in. And then you can see the modification I made to this unit over here. Basically what I did was I countersunk wells into this area in order for a nut to be secured in place. The bolt is going to secure on the top portion, sandwiching the grill covers in place. And then the nut is going to keep everything tight and permanently secured, and then we're going to have that descending portion which will then be able to plug into the tank. In order to do this, this was done on the drill press. I believe this is a 1/4 of an inch, or it's that one bit that's slightly larger than 1/4 of an inch. It's hard to say off the top of my memory, but this was drilled into this section over here. A drill press is absolutely mandatory in order to do this so that you have a nice square hole. And also, you have to have a depth properly set. And this is actually a very risky procedure. Fortunately, you do have what appears to be about 1/4 of an inch of material over here on the metal itself. However, when you are drilling in, you're going to be removing enough material so that that nut sits almost flush with this area over here, and because of that, you're going to be going dangerously close to the top portion. And if you're drilling through, you got to have that bit depth set absolutely perfectly. If not, and you drill all the way through, you're going to be in for some much more trouble compared to the way we have it here. And if that happens, that opens up a whole can of worms that fortunately I shouldn't be running into on this build. This one, I still have to drill the 2 wells on, which is going to be done off camera on the drill press. Like I stated before, you just set the depth and the piece just drills out to the appropriate amount. Once done, it's then time for installation. However, before I can go ahead and get these installed in place, I need to first secure on the mesh covers. And here we have the grills. At this point now are fully assembled with their meshwork and are going through their painting process. At the moment, they have a coat of flat black on to act as a primer, and then immediately after filming this, they're going to go and get their base coat of Dunkelgelb. The pieces I touched upon in the last video, these are a new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line where they come in a set where you get the 4 frames, and you also get a length of varmint mesh here for the actual, well, meshwork itself. The meshwork just gets trimmed to size. It's just a simple rectangle, minus maybe cutting off a little snippet of the angle on each side over there, just to allow clearance, I should say, for the fasteners to go through. But with the way the mesh cage is designed is that we have these sections that descend downward, much along the lines of the real one, and these act, in addition to giving you the real detailing, but it also acts as a guide, and it keeps the meshwork in place and prevents it from flopping around. Once the meshwork is cut to shape, it simply just glues in place with a few drops of super glue, and once completed, the meshwork is, at that point, all set. If I go ahead and temporarily fit it onto the piece here, like so, you can see how they look like once mounted in place. And as you can see, they really do enhance the grill work quite immensely. As I touched upon in the last video, the Armortek kit does give you the meshwork, although it's not really in this format. It's more or less just like a piece of screen on some of the older ones, and I believe on some of the new ones it might be a similar type of material. However, the kit ones, although they are basic and it's nice that they give it to you, it doesn't really have the full look as like a set like this has, and that's because this one has some more depth and dimension to it, not to mention some other geometry that you just can't get out of those other mediums. And again, once it gets fitted in place, you get to see how it stands off from the grill itself. And again, it just really makes it look more like the actual component. The parts are, again, 3D printed, and they are listed on the ECA catalog, as I just mentioned. And here are the engine grills, along with the box grill and the engine deck, all secured together. Like I touched upon before, the installation is a sandwich type affair, so when you're installing them, you basically need to install everything together. And once installed, you can see what they look like on the model. Obviously, they really do give a bit of extra detailing, giving that needed area of the mesh covers. And they blend in very well with the fan cover that I touched upon in the last video. Okay, so this is post-production John here chiming in, and I just want to mention that since I went ahead and filmed this scene over here, I went ahead and made some alterations to the actual production sets of these components. The first is with the material choice. The ones in this video are made out of an ABS material, while the production units are made out of a white nylon, and it's that same nylon material that's used on a large number of my 3D prints that are offered on the ECA catalog. The other is with the option on how these components are offered. The first option just gives you the 4 grill covers and the varmint mesh that we've seen in the previous portion of the video, while the other option supplies you with the 4 covers, the varmint mesh, but it also supplies you with the rings in order to fabricate the covers that are used on the fan sections. The only thing the builder needs to do is to pinch on the varmint mesh around the rings, much along the same lines as I touched upon in the previous video. Both options are again listed on the ECA catalog. And with that out of the way, let's continue with the remainder of this video. As for securing them in place, well, the fasteners were utilized. These ones over here are secured to the main back brace that we have right over here that I touched upon in the last video. And once secured on, it holds it on actually very, very well. There's really not a whole lot of play in these sections over here once the fasteners are definitely tightened down. As for the fasteners on the reverse side, like I touched upon before, they are just being held in place by those flush fitting nuts that I mentioned earlier on in the video. And here you get to see what the fasteners look like descending from the bottom portion. And as you can see, they all here will do a good job in locking the rear area to the tank itself. Also, the same modification that I made to the grills, I also made to these sections over here. And you can see what they look like with the nuts mounted in a flush fit manner. Some other things that are noteworthy to point out are the antenna well area. If I flip the piece around, you can see what the antenna well looks like integrally milled into this section over here. On the real vehicle, the antenna well is actually a separate component that is bolted to this top portion of plate. And on the model here, it's just a countersunk recess that is CNC'd into the aluminum. It has a pretty good effect out of the box. However, in order to fit on the actual antenna base, I needed to make an adapter. The adapter is just some resin that I turned on the lathe to create a plug type setup. Then that just super glues to the inside portion over here. Here I have a cast rubber antenna base, which is my own rubber casting. This is something that's not listed on the catalog, but if anyone is interested, hit me up and I'll definitely look into see if I could actually release these. Regardless, the antenna base will plug into this section right over here when the time comes. Of course, there will be an actual antenna wire, and since the piece is rubber, it does have some natural flex to it as it would on the actual unit. And obviously, it would behoove me to install this at the very tail end of the build because getting paint on this would be really counterintuitive. The next thing to mention is a bit of detailing that I didn't even know I needed until I was, well, up to this portion over here, and that involves these three holes. You see on the rear portion of the King Tiger, there is this triangular plate that gets fitted in this section, and the kit does supply you this. It's a CNC piece of aluminum. However, I'm having trouble tracking it down in the small remaining parts that are left for this model, and instead of just fabricating a new one from scratch, I was looking at the kit one in comparison to the one on my old, or I should say on my other Armortek King Tiger, and after comparing it with the real one, I seen that, perhaps there's a way to improve a little bit from the kit. And here you can see pictures of some CAD files that I drew up, and the detailing on there is a bit different compared to the ones found on the Armortek kit. The Armortek kit one, again, is pretty basic. It does the job more or less, but it does leave a little bit room for improvement, and that was added to the one that you see here. This one is a new 3D printed component from ECA. It is listed on the catalog, and currently I have one in production right now. Now, along with the plate itself, you'll notice that there are a few other fastener head details. Well, those are for the well itself. Like I touched upon before, the well is a separate bit of material that gets fastened from the outside, and you do have a bunch of these very notable fasteners found on the exterior location. Well, with the ECA set, it gives you those actual details so that you can add them to the model. Of course, they are currently in production. As soon as they come in, I'll throw them on the model, and you'll see what they look like in the next video. While also on the exterior, we have the cover plate that I mentioned in the last video. In the last video, I mentioned that I needed some extra long fasteners to install them, and boy, was that an odyssey in itself. I tried reaching out to my vendor, who I've been purchasing fasteners from for the longest period of time, and when I gave them the item number that I was looking for, the response they gave me back was pretty much. So I needed to go ahead and track down another source. Fortunately, I was able to do so. It took a little bit of time, more than I was expecting, but I got the fasteners in, and here you can see what they look like fitted in place. Obviously, this really fleshes out the rear portion very, very nicely, and it just gives that little bit of an extra detail kick. As for the other details that I added to the top portion, on the engine hatch stops, you'll see that I added these other little pins found in these 3 locations. These 3 pins are the stops for the engine hatch locks. So, as I touched upon before, there are these locks that pivot in this section over here, and it keeps the engine hatch from flopping around. Well, in order to prevent them from overturning, there are these little rods. They're just unceremonious rods that are welded to the top deck over here, and these stop the locks from over rotating in either direction. And it's a very brutally simple way of preventing the pieces from moving around. These units here are just metal rods, 1/16 of an inch steel rod that I drilled into the plate, and I just simply installed them, snipped them to shape, and that's all there is to it. The entire piece here was primed in red, just so that everything has a nice coat of primer before the thing will head off into paint, which will be actually very, very soon. On a similar note to the engine hatch moving around and potentially getting damaged, that takes us to the cyclone air filtration boxes. These, of course, are the units for the engine and have been seen and discussed many, many videos ago when I first built them. Well, over the course and duration of the build, they were moving around quite a bit, and because of that, they've received just a small amount of minor superficial damage, and at this point here they are going to be installed permanently to the engine, so I might as well go ahead and polish it up. Well, and here's the unit now completely repaired. Basically, the only thing that was done was the small little handles that we have here in the corners. All 4 of them broke off, and I went ahead and fabricated new ones, remounted them on, painted them with the same exact paint that I had on hand, which is fortunate because this was originally painted with Model Master light gray, and that's a color that's not really available anymore. So I was fortunate enough to have a bottle left on hand, so the touch-ups were all seamless. After the units were touched up, I also improved the weathering a little bit, giving it just for a little bit of extra chipping, giving it for a more, used look, which definitely matches the condition of the remainder of the engine compartment, also the remainder of the tank once it gets fully painted and weathered. But I just want to take a moment to point that out. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and get that installed, and let's carry on with the rest of the video. The next bit of equipment that's going to be fitted to the vehicle at this time is the antenna storage tube. This is something that's found on the Tiger 1, but for some reason the Panther doesn't have it located in the rear section, which is typically found on most German tanks. Regardless, the component that we see here is completely scratch built and is not supplied with the kit. The component is scratch built out of a length of brass tubing. 2 brass strips are soldered into these 2 locations right over here. Of course, there's a small little hole drilled into them so that I can secure this unit to the side portion of the hull with fasteners, which is probably the best way to do it. It keeps it on nice and secure. Glues alone obviously are not going to cut it, but the remaining details are made out of resin. We have here the 2 end caps, and these are just one-offs that I turned on the lathe to the shape that we have here. These are turned out of just some resin stock that I have on hand, and within a few minutes I have the components. They get glued in place via a plug type system, so they don't pop off or have the potential of breaking off during operation. And from here, that's really all there is to mention about that. So I'm just going to get this thing primed and then fitted to the vehicle. And here are the 2 rear sections fully completed, and at this point here they're ready for a shot of primer and then eventually ready to proceed into painting and final installation. For the components themselves, you'll notice that they have the breather valves fitted in place. The breather valves is something that's actually really, really interesting to mention on these King Tigers because they themselves had a developmental period much along the lines of many other German tanks where there's an early, mid, and late production type setup. The early production would have had 4 of these units in place, 2 on the rear and 2 just aft of the turret. And those ones have a very interesting plumbing setup. In fact, that's the format that I built my Armortek King Tiger for, where the ones on the back continue down and they actually move along the side of the hull. They're very, very interesting. The problem with rendering that format specifically for this vehicle is that the rear section needs to be removable. So obviously the plumbing, when it's all hooked up, is going to be very problematic to the point where it's almost impossible to really undertake in a removable format. Fortunately for the King Tigers, that the Germans themselves went ahead and saw that this system was overly complicated. I know, the Germans and overly complicated? Who would think? But anyway, the Germans themselves figured out, there's a better way to do this, so they made some modifications to the internal plumbing, and they were able to cut that down to 2 breather valves that we have here. The original 2 that were after the turret were deleted, and the only two that remained were the two that we have right here on the rear. In fact, this type of format was seen on the example, was that 213, the one that's in Belgium currently, the surviving example. And you can see remnants of these components in place. However, after the turret, there's no trace of the other valves release from what I've seen on the walk-around images. Then this system was, in use for a little while. However, at the very tail end, the Germans themselves said, you know what, we could do it in an even simpler way, where they, again, made some modifications to the internal plumbing, and they only have one breather on the one corner of the rear portion of the King Tiger. That version was basically exactly like what we see on the Panther and the Jag Panther, where it's just that one little lone breather valve sticking off the tail. Now, why did the Germans go ahead and do this whole complicated developmental format for the King Tiger when the Panther was already around and was proven at that point? Your guess is as good as mine. I'm just going to boil it down to Germans. But as for the simpler patterns, rather than having that very large elongated tube that runs along the side of the hull, they modified it a little bit, where it's just this simple little tube that comes out, bends over the wall of the hull, and is just open like the way you see it here. So on the model here, what you see is the ECA 3D printed breather valve. This is a new addition to the ECA catalog, and we also have a scratch-built little clamp on this section over here. I'm probably going to go ahead and add this to the sets. It's something I'm going to go ahead and throw up in CAD so that you have everything from the get-go in order to assemble the unit in this format. But this is something that remains to be seen. I'll probably have a note about that in the next video update. As for the tube, it's nothing more than a 16th of an inch piece of floor wire that was just, added in place and bent to the appropriate shape. And this does a great job with facilitating the detailing that we have here. So these units are going to be painted. With the turret removed, you can see what the engine deck looks like with it temporarily fitted in place. As I touched upon before, the unit is going to be permanently secured on after the model goes through its painting process, which will allow me the ability to mask up the inside portion over here to protect it from any sort of overspray. But with the grills fastened in place, all of the grill covers on, it really is fleshing out very nicely. The one other thing that needs to be added, but I'm waiting for it to be shipped from the printer, are the other grenade grills that go in these sections over here. There are these very distinctive grills that are found in these areas. These are something that I really needed to design after I had the engine deck in this format, and I actually completed them a little while ago. Here on screen you should see some CAD files of the images, or I should say of the items in question, and obviously once they get in hand, I'll be able to mount them onto the tank, and they will finalize this section over here, really finishing it off. But those are something that can be added even during the course of painting. But, however, that's probably something I'm going to be fitting on in about a week or so. So that's something that's going to be coming in sooner than later. Also, at this time here, well, let me go ahead and move the camera because it looks like the lift is moving on me. And I could go ahead and show some other little bits of detailing off. So on this side, you can see the addition of the fire extinguisher. This is a cast resin component from Armorpax. This is a bit of detailing that I cannot recommend enough, and it's something that always looks great on these 1/6 scale German tanks. The piece is a single resin casting, complete with the canister as well as the straps, and this is something that I always like to add after the tank is painted, because it's always best, in my opinion, to paint this piece off of the model, much along the lines as I do on my other smaller scale builds. However, this component here I cannot recommend enough, and it's always something that instantly improves the look of almost any German tank that you secure to. Again, highly recommended, and the link is found in the video description listed below. On the opposite side here, we have another tool mount fitted in place. This is for the clipper. The clipper and the tool mounts are part of a set, and these were a 6 scale icons component. Sadly, these pieces, I'm unaware of if they are still in production. 6 scale icons went out of business a number of years ago when the owner passed away, and since then the parts were acquired by another vendor, but I'm not sure if they're even still in production. So with that in mind, what you see here is basically a dinosaur of a era past. Fortunately, I have a sufficient supply of these on hand to basically build almost any German tank that I come across, but you know, that's something to be discussed in another video. Having said that, the clipper as well as the remainder of the tools that are going to be found on the model are going to be 6-scale icons, and you will be seeing more of that in the next video update, which should be dropping probably within a week or so of this one here, so stay tuned for that. One other important info to mention at this time is that the top portion of the engine has now been secured permanently in place. Like I touched upon before, this was mounted on with silicones, so it's a semi-permanent installation. It does a good job in keeping it where it needs to be. And if anyone's wondering, well, John, why didn't you just make the piece removable like you've done on your other Tiger 1 builds? The answer is pretty simple. With the Tiger 1, there is sufficient access over here in the engine compartment in order to pop the air filters off. However, on the King Tiger here, obviously, that's not a luxury that you have. And this is, again, true to form to the real one, which is why the Germans just made the entire plate come apart. This is also true to form, by the way, on the Panther as well. So with that out of the way, that brings us to the filler caps. As I touched upon before, there were a few iterations of this system, and now that you can see the unit temporarily fitted in place, you get to appreciate the detailing that it brings to the model. This was always an iconic bit of detailing that I personally enjoyed on both the Panther series as well as the King Tiger family. One of the other things that's top deck related that I want to mention involves these three sections here. These areas are going through their final bodywork phase. With the way the kit is designed, you have those three fasteners that I touched upon before that would secure everything in place. But since they are no longer necessary, I'm just going ahead and deleting them via the bodywork. In the next video, these are going to be completely polished away, and I'll touch upon them at that point. And over here, you get to see the antenna storage tube that I touched upon before. This is secured in place via those two small micro fasteners that I touched upon earlier. In order to add these, you need to drill 2 holes into this plate over here. Fortunately, this is easily done because of the sheer thickness of this plate and also the length of this plate. Drilling out these areas with a hand drill is something that's very easily done. Obviously, you want to make sure the holes are in the right locations, and once that's done, the piece goes on without any problems. With the way the piece is designed, it secures in place and is no way, in any way, shape, or form, going to inhibit the top deck or engine deck area from its potential removal. So with the turret placed back on and with the camera and tripod backed up all the way to the rear section here so that hopefully the whole model turns up on screen, you can see that for all intents and purposes, the tank is just about ready for painting. All major orifices have been plated over, either with pieces of detailing or with, sections of the top hull plate. And again, outside those small little handful of details, this thing, it's basically go time for paint. And a similar situation is true for the front. Outside of those handful of parts that I touched upon that are needed to complete the rear, there are also a few handful of components required to finish up the front and side area. Some of the components would include some details that need to be fitted to the hatch plate, many of which I already have on hand, but there's also a couple pieces that are in production right now. And outside of that, just the remainder of the tool posts are all that's required to get this thing done detail-wise and to head it off into paint, which is something that I'm eagerly looking forward to. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure so are a large portion of my subscribers as well as the customer himself. So again, this project here is definitely getting closer and closer to the end. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being large-scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller-scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted all the way since the project start, as well as photographs of all the other smaller and larger scale builds that are seen on this channel. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Until then.